Welcome to the Commonwealth Pavilion at Cop26. Our event today is entitled Climate Change and New Petroleum Producer Countries, Forging a New Path Towards an Equitable and Just Energy Transition. The event is co-organized by our host, the Commonwealth Secretariat, the Natural Resource Governance Institute, and the New Producers Group. My name is Amir Shafai. I'm from the Natural Resource Governance Institute, NRGI, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator for what I'm sure will be a very interesting discussion. Before we get into the discussion with the panel, let me say a few words maybe to set the scene. To set the scene for the countries that we're going to be focusing on. Those are developing countries that are relatively recently coming into the petroleum sector. 3 points I think are worth making. One is that these countries are wrestling, like the rest of the world, to define what the global imperative for a transition away from fossil fuels will mean for them. The IEA projections, as you know, require that there be no new fossil fuel projects if we are to meet the Paris goals, or at least project that there will need to be if we were to meet the Paris goals. That will impact all petroleum producers, but it will impact the developing countries that we're speaking about in a particular way. Point number 2. These countries are already facing reduced investor interest and support for financing in their petroleum sector. Recent developments, including an announcement last week from major donor countries that they will no longer be supporting public funding of fossil fuel projects abroad, is yet another measure in this direction. And point number 3, these countries are also trying to address emissions in their existing petroleum projects. Again, the announcement last week and the discussions that have been happening, including in this pavilion around methane emissions, are an indicator in that direction. So we're dealing with a challenging context in which these countries are trying to finance both their development ambitions and their climate goals. This has been made even more difficult by the reduction in the value of their oil and gas and climate finance commitments that have not been as forthcoming as many countries would have liked. So in this context, the New Producers Group, a joint initiative organized by the Commonwealth Secretariat, co-managed, I should say, by the Commonwealth Secretariat, Chatham House, and NRGI, has been convening a series of discussions amongst government officials for them to share their strategies and aims to achieve 3 goals. That's how to reconcile their petroleum sector, their climate ambitions, and their energy needs. Today's discussion builds off of those, and we will aim to explore the objectives and obstacles that these countries, developing countries, face. Joining us for the discussion today are representatives from 2 new producing countries, Suriname and Uganda, representative from the African Development Bank, Chatham House, and the Commonwealth Secretariat. My job as moderator is an easy one. Let this panel have the great discussion that I'm sure we will, and also try to make sure that we're on time. Without further ado, let's turn over to Dr. Valerie Marcel, the project lead of the New Producers Group, to give us more about the context in which we're operating. Valerie, over to you.
Thanks very much, Amir. I'm going to share my screen. So I thought we could start this panel with a bit of a scene setter to give a brief introduction to the New Producers Group, but especially to the countries that are in it. So The NPG, or the New Producers Group, as you said, Amir, is a peer-to-peer South-South network through which officials from 27 different countries have been exchanging their lessons learned, their practices, their challenges for almost 10 years. And while traditionally those challenges might have been around managing public expectations that could be unrealistic about the sector, managing price volatility, building institutions, dealing with the powerful oil companies, and governance issues. Over the last few years, our focus has been increasingly on managing the risks associated with the energy transition and thinking about what kind of new path emerging producers can forge to minimize their risks and increase their resilience as the world decarbonizes energy systems. And so you see we have a number of countries that are at the exploration stage, others at the development of discoveries, and also others that are early producers. So who are we talking about here? What are these countries like? And the first point to make is really that we're not talking about the petroleum producers we commonly think of, such as Nigeria, Venezuela, or Russia. So these are countries that, for the most part, have persistent energy gaps. They import their energy needs. And so this graph shows the share of population with access to electricity. And you can see that there's a persistent gap in a large number of the countries in the group, particularly in Africa. So in this context, increasing domestically produced cleaner energy really matters. It's a key development goal for many in the group. Many in the group are also low income and LDCs or lower middle income. And so in that context, it's clear that petroleum revenues matter. They matter to help address acute development needs that have persisted. And the group as a whole, the 27 countries, account for only 1.7% of the world's total greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gases. So here on this table, I'm showing the CO2 emissions per capita across most of the group. And you can see that they're much lower than the world average, with the exception of Caribbean small states that would be a bit above. And it's interesting too that many of them are carbon sinks. So I'm highlighting a few of them here. And for them, it's important in these climate negotiations to obtain rewards for managing their forests. And they are also vulnerable to climate impacts. So this graph shows in the colored dots the members of the group, and those that are in the left top quadrant are the most vulnerable globally to climate impacts and the least ready to deal with those impacts. And so most of our group is in that quadrant, and indeed all of the countries in our group that have significant discoveries that they're developing. With the exception of Suriname, which is represented in the panel today, which has a slightly lower level of vulnerability. So in this context, investment and adaptation is critical. And because their emissions are small, their mitigation efforts wouldn't really affect their vulnerability to climate impacts. So it really does go back to adaptation. So I think, we're talking about countries that are small players in the world of climate. They're small players in the world of petroleum also. And finally, maybe to point out that they're also struggling to attract green finance. And that's because they have that high vulnerability to climate impacts, and also because of the immaturity of their markets or their institutions. So that's another, I think, challenge that characterizes them. So I think I'll stop there and hear the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Valerie. Maybe I can go to the country perspective now. Agnes, you're the Chief Financial Officer of Staatsolie, Suriname's national oil company. Suriname is one of the few countries in the world that is carbon negative, but you've also had recent promising offshore petroleum discoveries. So you're very familiar with the dilemma, and you're also obviously part of the party delegation to COP for your country. Tell us how the perspective of Suriname is when we come to this debate, when it comes to obstacles.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Amir, for the introductions. Let me start by saying that I'm very happy to be part of this panel. And indeed, a dilemma, as you mentioned, Amir. And maybe it's good if I first give a context or a background about where the country stands at the moment. Suriname is classified as a middle-income country, as Valerie also showed in her graph by the World Bank. But the country is facing a very serious economic and debt crisis at the moment, with a negative economic growth of more than minus 15%, inflation of now 70% period to date, exchange rate depreciation since 2020 of more than 200%, and a unsustainable debt to GDP ratio of 150%. So we are a highly indebted country. So with these, I would say, economic indicators, you can imagine that it was inevitable for the country to execute a restructuring plan. And as we speak, the country is currently preparing for the IMF's board approval for the extended fund facility, and I'm crossing my fingers here, we do get the approval soonest. So that is setting the scene for the country. And where does the oil sector fits in this? As you mentioned, Amir, we are the NOC, the only oil producing company in Suriname. We have only onshore production of 6 million barrels a year, of which the majority is used as throughput in our refinery, which produces around 3 million barrels diesel and gasoline, supplying the local market, and the remainder is different variants of fuel oil. The country is, contrary to other new producers, a net exporter of oil, and the oil sector contributes for around 40% of oil exports. So there is where you see the reliance on the fossil fuels. And Amir rightfully said that we have had recent oil discoveries, and that is where the dilemma begins. Because looking ahead, you could say that these oil discoveries, they provide an opportunity to stabilize the economy. So there is a very high need for these revenues at the moment. And also to reposition for growth, like many other countries have done, and more importantly, for the investments in social programs and investments in other more sustainable sectors in order to diversify the economy. On the other side, Amir also rightfully said that Suriname is one of the few countries that is carbon negative. And that is owing to the 93% forest coverage we have as a country, and combined with low deforestation. And I think in that regard, we contribute as a carbon sink to the world. As a country, we do acknowledge the importance of climate change actions. Certainly because we are one of the vulnerable countries, small and less developed countries, vulnerable to climate change actions. And at the moment, the country is not ready to cope with any climate change impact. In that respect, I also want to mention, and make a relation to the energy transition, which is the topic of this COP26. And having said that, I think that talking about energy transition, certainly in the state where we are now, we would need the time first to recover our economy and bring our debt levels to a more sustainable level. But we do realize that we need to decarbonize. A positive item for Suriname is that the country is currently has a 50% clean energy mix. 50% is generated with hydropower. And this brings us in a very, I would say, good starting position in the energy transition. So how would you then approach, knowing that we need the time to go through this energy transition? I think a phased approach would be needed. Approach where, in the interim, we would need to use gas as our transition fuel, because the gas is part of the offshore discoveries. And two other positive items I can mention is that the country has a zero flaring policy for all new oil developments. And also very positive is that we have an established major RED Plus strategy and program, also with involved, interested energy parties. And I think that while we're in the interim using gas as our transition fuel, I think it's also very, very important that we look ahead and plan for our long-term energy transition plan, which is to look and analyze the different resources we have, and what are the most optimal solutions. And I'm really thinking about the more low-cost renewables and diversifying, investing in sustainable sectors in order to diversify our economy. So that's it for now, I think, Amir. But if you give me the chance, I would also like to welcome the Honorable Silvano Chongahing, our Minister of Spatial Planning and Environment of Suriname, and of course, all the other delegates here joined in the pavilion and all other participants online. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Agnes, and thanks for reminding us of where we sit. And it's hard to, in this Zoom universe, we forget that we're actually sitting at COP. There are delegates, there are representatives of government negotiating here now. Maybe I can actually go to Fred Onya from the National Environmental Management Authority of Uganda. I think in composing this panel, this duality shines quite clearly. We have one representative from the National Oil Company and one representative from the Environmental Authority. So Fred, speak to us about how Uganda's commitment to its climate goals gets reconciled with your developmental needs when it comes to this sector and beyond.
Yes, thank you. Fred Onyai, my name. I come from the Pearl of Africa, that's Uganda. And it's the Pearl of Africa because it's given by nature. It's given. It's a natural country that is nurtured by a lot of endowments from nature, and therefore I must say that I'm happy to be here. And maybe to come on to your question, I would like to appreciate the context in which this setup has been made for this discussion. And I also appreciate what Amir and Valer presented. It has given us an unpacked what Uganda is. And therefore, I would not do so much to talk about the country in terms of its locational characteristics. But maybe before I talk about the goals or the commitments we have in climate change and environmental sustainability, I'd like to say that my discussion is going to be in the context of climate resilience and environmental sustainability. I will not talk much about the oil industry because for sure that's an area where we need another panelist to be here. But however, we as Uganda, we are saying that we are endowed by a number of other sectors. Uganda, agriculture accounts for 21% of the GDP. Industry accounts for 26%. And I must say that in terms of energy resources, Uganda is again well endowed because we've got a number of other sources that are renewable sources. Apart from the automobile fuel, most of the industries and other energy sources are from hydroelectric power. And therefore, in terms of energy at the moment, I must say Uganda has a clean energy because we are still using hydroelectric power from our ecosystem resources. That's from water resources. However, we are also aware that Uganda is developing infrastructure for oil production, oil and gas production. But also, there are some preparedness areas that we cannot underscore, because, we cannot downplay, because from support of government of Uganda and other development partners like Oil for Development Program for Norwegian government, our capacity has been built to manage the environmental aspects of oil and gas in terms of legislation, in terms of policy, in terms of capacity building of government institutions from local government to central government. So capacity has been built to manage the environmental aspects of oil and gas. And therefore, until now, from the point of view of exploration, up to the time now we are going to begin production, we have not had any events that can cause us uneasiness. Because, for example, Uganda is among the few countries that even came in and stopped the flaring. So already we are prepared to manage the environmental aspects of oil and gas, in terms of pollution and the rest. However, we are also aware that Uganda is still vulnerable to environmental degradation and the climate change. And that does not make us to sit back. It means that National Environment Management Authority, Ministry of Water and Environment, and other sectors have to come on board to ensure that the aspects of oil and gas is well managed. Take into account that this is yet a revenue to be for the country. Government has invested a lot of money in terms of infrastructure, in terms of capacity building to manage the oil and gas resource. And that investments cannot be lost. But we need to be prepared to manage the investments for the betterment of the people of Uganda, while taking into account climate resilience and environmental sustainability. Now, for that matter, of course, we have got the National Climate Change Policy that has to be mainstreamed in all sectors. We have got the National Climate Change Act. We have got the National Environment Act. We have got the National Environment Management Policy. We have got enough policy and legal infrastructure to manage this resource in terms of climate change, climate resilience, and environmental sustainability. Maybe what the challenges will come later. If I can have time, I will mention it. But now what we are saying is the dilemma of energy transition. I believe, and me as a person, but also as my country, we believe that transition means gradual change. And therefore, gradual change does not mean revolution. So there should be system support. It means we have to change gradually. Because even the developed countries who are today are saying that we are not going to provide investment support for oil and for fossil fuel. I think, and I believe they started preparing some 50 or so years ago. Now they've come up with the resolutions, which are okay. They are good for clean energy. But we are saying where the new producing countries have reached, we have invested a lot in oil and gas, but we need support for system change. So it means we need to gradually change from the policy point of view and legal point of view and institutional point of view. It means our capacity must be built to manage and uphold the revenue from oil and gas for the people's welfare in terms of livelihoods and other welfare assets. But at the same time, we should also take care of the climate resilience and environmental sustainability. And Uganda, as I talk now, is prepared in terms of institutions and policies and laws. What is missing is policy alignment. Can we therefore align this policy to mainstream the aspects of climate change in all sectors? Possibly two areas of concern here. One, how far can we implement our NDC? In Uganda, our NDC has been updated, and now we have also updated our target. From 22% by 2030 below business as usual, now we have gone to 24.2%. And we are focusing on both mitigation and adaptation. Because for us as a developed countries, and also Uganda being a tropical country, adaptation and mitigation makes almost no difference, because one leads to the other one and vice versa. So we are looking at the issue of clean energy, for example, energy efficiency, fuel efficiency in the transport and energy sector respectively. That's under mitigation. but also we are looking at the issue of ecosystem resilience, ecosystem sustainability, and area of adaptation. So we're looking at our forest cover. We need to move our forest cover from the current 10.2% to 15% by 2050. 2025. We are looking at increasing our wetlands coverage from the current 9.08 to 9.58 by 2025. This is within our National Development Plan 3. So there are already commitments as a country to ensure that the ecosystems, because even in terms of energy balance in the country, our energy is the national source of energy are water in Uganda. Water accounts for 80% of our economy. In terms of energy, it's almost over 90%. In terms of hydro, electric power, and other ecosystem sources for water. So if we conserve the forest, if we conserve the wetlands, therefore we are conserving the water resources that will enhance energy infrastructure, which is the hydroelectric power. We have got wind energy, which is the minimum scale, but we have got the geothermal, which is also of high potential. So for us, Uganda, we are not worried of the transition. We are concerned of the fairness and equity discussion. Let there be fairness, let there be equity, that technology, for example, should be accessible by all, so that we have got clean and resilient, climate resilient energy, environmental friendly energy. But once technology is denied, capacity denied, financing is denied, then we cannot talk about equity and fairness and justice. Therefore, so climate justice must take into account equity in access to resources. And therefore, our partners, the developed countries, we need to come to a talking table. One, system support in terms of policy, legislation. Two, access to technology must be equitable. And the three, the issue of financing. Last but not least, capacity building. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fred. One of the objectives of this session is to help define, from the perspective of countries such as Suriname and Uganda, what is a just and equitable transition. So I think your intervention goes very much in that direction. Maybe we can zoom out a little bit to the regional and support structure that you asked for. Fred Kabanda, if I could turn to you, Fred Kabanda of the African Development Bank and African Natural Resource Center. Fred, I'm sure the messages that you're hearing from Fred, Onyai, and Agnes Mwansi resonate with you. Fred, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
Oh, you are.
Sorry.
Okay. Yes. Sorry, we lost you on screen for a minute there. I just wanted to start by saying, to what extent do these messages resonate with what you're hearing from the member states of the African Development Bank as far as development needs are concerned, and specifically something that Agnes, obviously not from the African continent, but a message that resonates here as well, or there as well, is this issue of gas, the role of gas as a transitional fuel, or as a role in the energy transition. What are you hearing from African governments on that front?
Thank you very much, Amir, for this introduction. I would also like to thank the organizers for inviting the African Development Bank to be part of this important discussion. Now, first of all, allow me to highlight basically the perspective of the African Development Bank on climate change and energy transition as I set the stage. The African Development Bank, in our 10-year strategy, we have mainly two objectives. One, inclusive growth, but two, transition to green growth. And all our priorities and projects are emphasizing addressing the climate change issues. And this is basically because we know that even when Africa is not a big emitter of greenhouse gases, we have adversely been affected and impacted by this issue. Now, the ambitions we hear from our different governments are that the governments would like to seek a reliable and affordable modern energy in order to facilitate socio-economic transformation of the people of Africa. But currently, with a population of 1.3 billion, only half of this population can access electricity. And out of this 1.3 billion, only a quarter of this, about 400 million people, can access clean cooking. And so this is a dilemma. even for the people who have access to electricity, their per capita consumption is very small because one, it is not sustainable, it's not always available, but number two, even the price is exorbitant. So they keep switching on and off. And so we must find solutions. But as we look at solutions, we also have to look at what is the setup now. And when we look at the setup, all the statistics we see that talks about Africa tends to generalize, but I must put it into context to say that Africa is not uniform. There are people who have near 100% access to electricity, but there are also those who are 10% or less, depending mainly on the kind of energy mix they have, which determines the price. And so there are basically three aspects relating to energy in the sub-Saharan Africa. One is that most people use biofuels for their final energy consumption. The last report of the International Energy Agency showed 54% of all Africans use biofuels compared to a world average of 10%. So this is kind of unique. And when we use biofuels, it is not sustainable because we are actually contributing more to greenhouse gases as we cut the biofuels into charcoal and firewood. The second aspect is on electricity. Electricity generation is mainly from hydropower, which is dependent on seasons. And so sometimes if it's a dry season, there could be less power generated and more when it is a rainy season. So this is another aspect that's not sustainable. The other energy generation that is used for electricity is coal. But like you know, coal is dirty. And because of these aspects of biofuel and reliability in hydropower, dirty coal, but also the aspects of the slow entry to renewables, there is then a challenge of how can we use the resources that exist, and specifically natural gas. Natural gas is the cleanest fossil fuel in terms of CO2 emissions. And this is how or why it could be used as an anchor in order to integrate and change from the different energy sources into the renewable energy. As I started, I indicated the wish of the African Development Bank is actually to have renewable energy. But we must make sure that this actually comes in a gradual and systematic fashion. Natural gas currently exists in many African countries in the sub-Saharan Africa. Mozambique, for instance, hosts about 150 TCF. Tanzania, 57 TCF of natural gas. Other countries like Senegal, Mauritania, Ghana, all these countries have natural gas. Nigeria, of course, has the biggest reserve. But there is also an aspect of those that produce oil and bring associated gas with it. And so gas exists. And when I did a mapping of where are the different natural gas sources, we saw that natural gas actually neighbors nearly all the countries that are currently using coal for power generation. Meaning we can actually use natural gas to gradually replace the coal power generation in sub-Saharan Africa. This indeed would be a good thing because we would be able to reduce on emissions, but also use local resources and relatively cheaper in order to be able to maintain our greenhouse gases at a lower cost, at a lower levels. But the challenge that comes with this is the infrastructure. I mean, when we look at pipelines, for instance, in Africa, there are less than about 2,000 kilometers of pipeline for natural gas. And when you map this to Europe, for instance, this would be, a zone or district in one of the countries in Europe. So infrastructure is a big challenge. But in addition to infrastructure that includes pipelines, there are power pools that do not, exist. It would be good if we had a power pool that is interconnected within the regions in order to be able to use this. This is something that we must be able to look at and see how to take forward. Gas domestication is another aspect. I mean, in addition to using natural gas for power, we have noticed that in the countries which are producing natural gas, in Mozambique, for instance, and Tanzania, industrialization has grown by about 50%. This creates jobs. And so this can be used as a transition if the power was available to many more countries. I mean, aspects of imported LPG, the use for cooking gas is another aspect that is very critical, because with LPG, then you'll be able to reduce on the cutting down of trees and therefore be able to actually create a carbon sink when you are not using this. So basically, in a summary, I would just like to say, when you use natural gas, you can actually earn by gaining carbon credit. And looking at the volumes, one may argue that Africa is not able to consume all of it. But the other reason is LNG growth has been projected up to 2035 at 3.4% and up to 2050 at 0.5%. So there is definitely a market out there. So the energy transition is here. It will not be quick. It will not be cheap. And the opportunity to have natural gas as a cleaner fuel of transition is important in accessing electricity to the sub-Saharan Africa, but also use both domestic resources, revenues, and institutional frameworks going forward. So basically, we have to start now, because if the infrastructure is going to be put in place, it takes time. And the earlier it is put in place, the earlier it is able to be used. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Fred. Nadia, over to you. In your experience as the Commonwealth Secretary, you're dealing with developing countries and at least less developed countries and small states all the time. Given this dilemma that we're talking about, how do you see the opportunities and challenges between the opportunities the countries are looking to seek and develop, and the commitments that the world needs to make in order to tackle climate change?
Thanks, Amir. I think we've heard quite a lot from my esteemed panel members, but I would probably start off by saying that these aren't easy issues we're discussing, and as a whole, what we're really talking about is the multiple objectives of development, climate, and energy access. Each of these are so critical and complex in its own right. And countries trying to attain objectives in each of these areas really face multiple, complex, and compounding challenges. So I think the first thing to recognize is, I think Valerie gave us a really great introduction to the countries, but we use the element of groupings according to income classifications, which really doesn't underscore the great need and the vulnerabilities of the particular groups of countries we're talking about. So these groups of countries, as we've heard, face significant development needs. And what we're talking about here is, the standard of living and people's prosperity. So a lot of the populations face extreme poverty. In some countries, 1 in 3. That's really what we're trying to look at. So we have the element of, for various structural and legacy issues, we have high development needs, and we also have extreme vulnerabilities with respect to the economy, with respect to debt, with respect to limited access to finance. And critically, as Valerie said, these countries are already bearing the brunt of the climate crisis. They're facing the worst effects of it already. So I think that there's a little bit of recognizing the countries themselves were starting off from a very different position. On top of that, I would say that the pandemic has recently exacerbated those issues, and it's going to get worse. In general, developing countries, small states, least developed countries, after economic recessions, they generally lag behind the rest of the world, and they take 3 to 5 years longer for economic recovery. So that makes these situations worse for these particular group of countries. We've heard as well the issue of energy access. Now this relates on twofold. One, it's for the general population. So here we're talking about power, electricity, critically access to clean cooking. In some of these countries, it's less than 5%. Less than 5% have access to clean cooking. but it's also for industrialization. As we've talked about and we've heard from others, really a lot of these countries need to have energy to industrialize. How do we do that effectively? And I would add on top of that, we're dealing with the oil and gas sector. We all know this is a risky business. And post-Paris, it's gotten riskier. So we all know of the dreaded resource curse. And in my view, the energy transition has increased the likelihood of these particular set of countries being afflicted by the resource curse. Why? First, the likelihood of receiving government revenues at the same level is not going to occur. Revenues are going to be lower going forward than they were in the past. Volatility is going to be higher. Given the structural vulnerabilities I talked about, debt, etc., this puts these countries at greater risks. And the other element is the sharing of the carbon risks. These countries are disproportionately going to bear carbon risks. Think about stranded assets. Think about decommissioning. How are we really factoring these things as we think about developing the sector? So I think those are some of the challenges. But I don't want to paint too a dark and a gloomy of a picture, because I think there are a lot of opportunities and potential as well. And I think it comes in twofold. So one, as we've heard, countries have high ambitions with respect to low carbon development strategies. And I think here, one of the critical things that existing countries who are petroleum producers face is the difficulty of economic diversification. And this group of countries who aren't on that petroleum dependent path as yet have a real opportunity to do things differently, in my view, to get ahead of the curve, if you will. So the element of actually identifying and developing these non-oil and gas sectors in parallel from today is critical. That's what really a lot of existing petroleum producing countries are struggling with. That, I think, is critical. And I think the other element is, very importantly, we have the opportunity to leapfrog existing producers, right? So in terms of ensuring that the assets and the infrastructure that is going to be developed is at the lowest carbon intensity. That's really critical. And again, because it's new infrastructure, new things are being built, you have the opportunity to do so. And the other is, again, Fred shared quite powerfully the element of the need for energy. So there's a massive potential here. Again, it's building, it's not shifting. We have the opportunity to actually create energy systems that are not carbon dependent. As Fred shared, many countries are actually resource blessed in terms of solar, wind, etc. So herein we have the opportunity to redefine domestic energy systems, transportation, power. We can do things differently. But I think as well, we need access to finance. Because of all of these challenges, right now, the discourse tends to be, there is great opportunity, but. And I think what we need to do together is move this dialogue so it's that we have this great opportunity and here's how we can get after it. I think that's the difficult and the complex challenge.
And I'm going to put exactly that question to our country representatives, Agnes and Fred Onyai. We've talked about some of the obstacles. Where is it that you need support, and where should that support be coming from? Agnes, first to you, please.
Yes, thank you for the question, Amir. When you mention obstacles, I tend to look for the opportunities. and looking at the solution space, I see three, and also connecting to what I've heard. And really, I'm pleased that I'm part of this collaboration platform. I think that's where we learn and make connections. And I'll try to make some connections to what has been said earlier. So in the solution space, I really see these three opportunities. First, where I think as a small and less developed country, we would like to see the facilitation of our offshore oil developments, and of course, in such a manner that we minimize our carbon footprint. And at the moment, in the offshore, we have the IOCs, and we are in a beneficial position because we have not started yet. So we can design as we go. And I think it's important that we do require, and I think that they will have that as their mandate as well, to produce and develop and produce while minimizing the carbon footprint. I think one of the second, no, let me go back to the gas as our transition fuel. Just to give you an appreciation about the pricing of electricity in Suriname. I mentioned we are 50% clean already with the hydro power. So this hydropower is around 2 cents, 2 US dollar cents per kilowatt hour. Thermal, which is another 50%, which is using heavy fuels, is around 13 cents. So you can see the difference there already. If we would want to increase the hydropower capacity, it means that we will go against different other objectives we have in terms of the environment, interior, the people living in the interior, etc., access to waterways. And even if we would look at those hydro projects, those would have a price of around, I would say, 12, so a little bit less than the thermal, but almost equal to the thermal. So what's the solution in terms of cost, but also in terms of carbon footprint, is using the gas offshore. So we would like to be facilitated in producing and developing that gas. According to the drilling up to date and the subsurface, I would say, assessments we have done, the projection is that there is around 10 trillion of cubic feet gas, which is a valuable amount. So in the short term, certainly already 50 million of that during the oil production could be used to bring the gas to shore for power generation. And then, of course, in the longer term, we could use the gas to also industrialize further our bauxite sector, etc. So that is where I see the first opportunity. The second opportunity is when we have, let's say, stabilized the economy, because that will be our current highest priority at the moment, to stabilize the economy and to also bring our debt levels to more sustainable level. When we have reached that point, I think it's good as a country to also save for future generations. And I think that we could use the Savings and Stabilization Fund for that. That law has been passed already in 2019, but it's not effective yet. But first we have to stabilize the economy, and then we can save for future generations. And the third part is very, very, very important. And Fred also mentioned it, is the coordination within the government and all other stakeholders, making sure we do get aligned on defining our long-term energy transition, right? Because a very important key item in providing a certain vision in there is that we make sure that we allocate investments for more sustainable sectors and trying to reorient our economy and move away from the dependency on not only fuels, but also other commodities, right? Suriname at the moment depends for around 40% in their revenues on those commodities. So price volatility, it can hit the country very much. So this is where I see the three opportunities. And all in all, most important is the carbon sink we have in Suriname. And we need support. We need, and I'm looking at the international community. I'm looking at the developed world and cry out for the support. And it's technical support, and with technical support, I do mean capacity building. Many institutions within the government, they need that capacity building, technology transfer, but also very, very important, access to financing. So I think that, having said that, it's important that we do get this support, and it's not doubling, what the developed world is doing, but I would say quadruple that, making sure that we as small and developed countries also get in line to be there in having a certain part in that energy transition and making it work for the society in those countries. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Agnes. And important to hear financing, but not just financing. I know the New Producers Group has tried to do a lot of actually coordination between different government officials, even in countries. So I think that's an interesting point as well. Fred Onya, over to you. Where do you see the need for support? You spoke about it already a bit, but
I would like to say, first of all, what Fred ADB said is a reality. Transition has come, and nobody should be left behind. So we should all be supported to uphold it and live by it. And what Nadira also said that the opportunities that are in place, so not all is lost. So when we begin from policy to actions, in Uganda, I already said we have a number of sector policies. Now, what we need to do is to go forward for sector policy alignment. So we need to align our policies to suit transition. And therefore, we call for sector coordination. We should become more coordinated than before, because now we are going to have a common goal. The common goal within the development perspective, that is the energy transition, clean, efficient, affordable, and accessible energy, but which is climate resilient and environmentally sustainable. So in this regard, therefore, apart from aligning our sector policies and therefore the institutional arrangements, then we're moving to actions. Now in actions, we have got 3 areas. One, we have got the NDC. So NDC in Uganda, we have got the mitigation aspects, the mitigation measures, basically handling the issue to do with the industries, energy, waste, agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, and transport. That is taking care of investments, therefore. That's called for the need for investment in those areas in terms of energy efficiency and fuel, energy efficiency, clean energy and fuel efficiency. But the other area is the adaptation. As I said, in Uganda, in most African countries, this move together because ecosystem resilience, people's resilience, social resilience is very important. So for us to do that, we have to restore our ecosystems. When we restore the forest cover, restore the wetlands cover, restore the natural water systems or the water resources, we are able to have sustainable hydroelectric power generation in that country. Opposed to what Fred said, yes, because now seasonal rains is because of climate change. But now once we can combat climate change, then we are restoring all these ecosystems. We can restore our energy. Uganda is endowed by a number of other energy sources. That's now the 3rd area of support. We have got a number of renewables. We have got solar, we have got hydroelectric power, we have got geothermal. Now what do we need? Now we need technology. Technology to make this energy more abundant, available, accessible, cheap, and therefore affordable, therefore accessible. So if once this is done, and then the call for sector integration comes in now. Uganda doesn't need a lot of investment to diversify its economy because most of the sectors are already productive enough. The oil and the gas sector is mainly for national revenue. But time will come when this national revenue should be invested into other sectors. Uganda can invest in tourism, for example, and earn more money than in oil and gas. But that means that the investment, the revenue from oil and gas is potentially good to be invested in other sectors. But now the other challenge we have is the capacity. The capacity, in terms of institutional capacity, do the institutions understand the transition? Do all these sectors understand the transition? We are here at Glasgow and in other fora, this kind of transition, but do all of us, when we go back to our governments, if you go to all the departments, the ministries, the local governments, do we understand transition? So awareness, knowledge transfer, and skilling are very important that we need to look at. Of course, I'm not shy away by saying that we are also aware that much as we're talking about poverty eradication, we cannot eradicate poverty mainly through only revenue. We need to diversify incomes from other sources. The people must be rich. It's not a sector to be rich. So the people can be rich from other sectors too. So it means we need to avoid the common say of the Dutch disease. So the oil revenue should really be potentially for all sectors. That's what I would say. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think it would be nice to get some questions, but so if we quickly go back to Fred Kabanda and Nadira. Fred, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this financing question. Multilateral development banks are obviously stepping away from fossil fuels from a financing perspective, but is there support of some sort that you see a role for multilateral development banks to answer these needs that you're hearing from the countries on the panel today?
No, thank you very much. And I'll be very brief since we have little time left. It is true that financing towards fossil fuels is now limited. When we last did a mapping of the MDBs and financial institutions that could support the fossil fuels, they were quite limited. And the model of financing this kind of industry is that they spread the risk. And so when one is stepping away, the syndication becomes quite complicated. But I would also like to emphasize that the transition is not going to be cheap either. We have looked at, the money that is required for Africa alone. 136 billion will be required per year in order to do that transition. And so the alternative is not that easy. Otherwise, countries will get very indebted. But I would like to indicate that in addition to not financing directly these fossil fuels projects, the MDBs and the other institutions still hold climate financing, which could be used for mitigation and adoption of aspects that relate to climate change. So this is an area. But in addition, there are other areas other than financing that the MDBs can still work on. And for Africa specifically, it is very important to understand that a lot of research will still be required. A lot of capacity building will be required. Knowledge generation for informed policy making will be required. And these are among the other aspects that the MDBs can still work on and provide aspects of knowledge and advice. And finally, the aspect of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is another that could be taken advantage of. So in brief, even with difficulties accessing financing from MDBs for fossil fuel projects, the MDBs still have a role. And the African Development Bank specifically will not abandon its member countries. We will continue to provide support for a smooth transition using all methods that are available. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fred. Nadir, we're looking for solutions as well as obstacles. We want to be optimistic. This is the aim as well. What do you see as far as possibilities, as far as innovative solutions that these countries should be thinking about?
So I think there are probably at least two real tangible things that we can be doing now. And I think this is at the heart of what we're trying to get at, right? We can't be looking at this in terms of 10 years or 30 years from now. It's today. And one area is really, as Fred mentioned, the key thing is we need to also ensure that there is economic growth and employment outside of the oil and gas sector. The sector itself is actually not a very, the most well-known for employment. And I think one area that we can use is quite often in terms of looking at local content, which tends to be a focus area, but local content in oil and gas. I think we should apply that methodology for the other non-oil and gas sectors. We should really be looking at much more in-depth analysis and identifying what those non-oil and gas sectors are that would help alleviate employment and provide employment today. And again, just thinking about the time difference here, when you're looking at the oil and gas sector, employment does come, but it doesn't come today. It comes in probably 10 years if you're lucky, or maybe 15, right? Whereas if it is, again, it's going back to providing the opportunities today. If it is we were able to craft something, again, it's used industrial baseline surveys within the oil and gas sector, we need to do that for the renewable sector. That is how we create the vehicle and new engines of growth for these groups of countries specifically. And I think another area, Amir, is for us to actually shift this into thinking back to where I started, which is the characterization of the countries. And also the description of we're starting off today at pretty much already at net zero, really. So for these groups of countries, they are already, broadly speaking, at net zero. The rest of the world is looking at net zero 2050. We are here today, all right? So we need to be looking much more closely at the projects to ensure that the things we've been talking about are done. How do we ensure and look at decisions that are being made to ensure that actually everything that's being done possibly to reduce scope 1 and 2 emissions are being done? How do we do that, right? Also the element of financing, where there are, and there will be, you'll not be able to get all of the emissions out of the system, where you do have to then invest in carbon offsets. Why not invest in the country? Again, it comes back to addressing the financing gap. If you were to then deploy that capital within the country, you then have the opportunity to create employment now, today, and again, help create the renewable sector as opposed to the non-renewable. So I think really re-looking at how we're approving these projects and really focusing not just in terms of the GHG emissions. I would highly advocate, and we're about to publish a toolkit and guidelines on this, the field development plans, which is what governments approve for these projects, should be including a greenhouse gas emissions management plan to ensure that the countries keep at net zero. We can't wait to then create the problem and then, in 10 and 15 years, think about how do we get to net zero. We have the opportunity to do it now. So I think it just really requires looking at it in a different way and recognizing that it's diversity, right? No two countries are the same, no two contexts are the same. And we have the opportunity to do things differently. But these countries right now are an afterthought. And I think we need to change that. We can't use the existing models and then just copy paste. It just doesn't work. So I think that's part of it as well. Really looking at it from the perspectives and driven by the needs of the country.
I think on your point about field development plans, I think it's an actor we haven't mentioned, which is the international oil companies, right? They're a player in this. The greenhouse gas emissions, the offsets or whatnot. There's responsibility there as well. It's something that we don't talk about. We talk about whether they invest or don't invest, but we don't talk about necessarily how they invest in an energy transition context in these countries. So.
Yeah, and I mean, a good point. And I think, again, looking at the approval of the project, it's a great way as well, given the capacity, asymmetry between governments and companies, to shift the burden of a lot of the analysis onto the companies. So again, demonstrating what are the likely outcomes on revenues to governments in different situations and different scenarios. And again, it just helps with respect to the data collection, again, in terms of trying to understand the different potentials, the different paths, really having informed decision-making and understanding of the risks is what we're trying and should be doing with these approval projects. And I think that's a key way to manage the asymmetries, information as well as capacity, shifting the burden to the developing, away from the developing countries to the companies who are actually putting together the projects. The capacity exists there. And it's just much more about the dialogue and the availability of information. And sorry, Amir, one other thing is that, we need to recognize as well the importance of transparency here. These things even more so now, as I mentioned, resource scarce risks are elevated. And one of the best ways to kind of minimize that is through transparency. We really need to be having much more open dialogues about the risks that we're accepting, how we're managing it, and what we're going to be doing differently.
With the balancing act that needs to be done, transparency is particularly important. If our hosts allow, maybe if there's any questions from the floor, please.
Thank you. It's Clayton Lan from the Environment and Society Program at Chatham House. Thank you to all the panelists. This was a really fascinating discussion, and it's one that we really need to have. I just wanted to throw a bit of a spanner in the works about gas, because I think it's extremely context specific as to whether the costs will really work out, especially with the falling costs of renewables and storage technology and a range of other things that you might do in your economy to reduce demand, because the need for the idea of gas being a transition fuel is often based on it being baseload, and there's a lot of CCGT plants that African countries plan or want to have that would provide baseload, but the model for a clean and efficient energy system is changing quite rapidly towards one that's much more flexible and doesn't lock in that long-term demand for what is still a high carbon fuel. But even if the emissions don't matter too much to the country, the cost of the infrastructure will, and the time it takes to pay off the capital for that infrastructure. So even a country like Ghana, that's been quite successful in getting gas power online, and has the oil exports to help pay for that, it got a lot of help from the World Bank and others, and it continues to flare much more gas than it has expected, and then faces like large take or pay penalties as a result of the over-optimistic demand projections. So I think there's some caveats depending on the production profile and the capacity of the country. And it comes back to Fred Onyai's point about system support. So I think this is incredibly important point for the MDBs and the other donors, which plays to what you said, Fred, about the different ways that they can support countries if they're not investing in fossil fuels. And that is especially in terms of assisting countries with an integrated energy assessment and planning tools, which really assess the full costs and not based on old information, but based on a very fast changing market, and looking at how a much more whole systems, looking at building efficiency and transport and cooking in a holistic way. Options for mini grids and solar home systems and so on could be something could be visualized, and so the government would have different options, and then see where gas could potentially fit into that or not. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Greta. The issue of carbon lock-in and having an accurate assessment of energy needs is obviously a very challenging one in a range of countries. I don't know if Fred Kabando or Fred Onyai or others want to react to that, or if there's any other questions from the floor. Please, sir.
Well, this is Larry Hands from Citizens Climate Lobby, and I just wanted to suggest that if you're looking at fossil fuel-based infrastructure, make sure you include some sort of at least internal cost to carbon, internal carbon cost on that, to see if it really does make sense. Because if you're not adding $20 or $30 or $50 a ton for carbon dioxide emissions from the facility, you're probably not taking account for the damage that could be done to your economy if it falls apart.
And obviously lots of movement there within different jurisdictions that will make that a reality sooner rather than later.
Yeah, my name is Selfano Chanahin from Suriname. First of all, my compliments to all the presenters. Mention was made by the representative of the African Development Bank relationship. I think he named 2 African countries where the transition was made to gas, and that spurred industrial development, industrial growth. And this is exactly the answer that many of us are looking for, because we are being promised by scientists that if we make a transition, it will probably spur growth. How was this done? Can he explain a little bit more about that? And another remark I really have to emphasize is that along all the presentations that were made, there's one very important factor that is capacity constraints, especially in developing countries. And I believe that especially the multilateral development banks need to take this into account. We really need to redesign an economic model. If we don't do that with developing countries, the Dutch disease that Holland used to have like 50 years ago or so, we're doomed to get this again in our countries, especially looking at the capacity constraints that we're facing. So I think there's a challenge there for multilateral banks to, instead of just stopping investments in fossil fuels also try to revisit our economic model and support for capacity constraints. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fred Cabana, that sounds like it's coming in your direction, both on the forward linkages in industrialization, but also the prior comment of how that may not be as great as promised, right? That the gas demand might not be as great as one would expect. Any reactions to those two?
Yes, very briefly, I could just say two things. One, I think for all energy models, there definitely has to be an economic analysis. And one of the things that will bring down costs is what is the production cost for the gas. In other words, it's going to be very competitive in terms of renewables, new renewables, or new fossil fuels. And the lower the production costs are, the more competitive it will be. And so the aspects of taxation of CO2 will definitely will have to be put on top of that. But in addition, technology is also advancing in terms of carbon capture. CCSU, carbon capture storage and use, is another aspect that could also be looked at. In other words, you would then be able to pay less if you are emitting less. But in general, what I would like to say is that there are countries in Africa that have no access to energy. They are at zero. They have resources in their backyard, and they would like to develop these. So what are those options that they could use in order to develop these at a lower cost? So it's the economics that will eventually try to prevail at the end of the day. The second aspect on the industrialization is similar, where gas has been discovered in Tanzania from the Songo. A pipeline was done to Dar es Salaam, and a special zone was created for industry. In one zone, a special exclusive zone that was put for industry in order to be able to use that gas from one location. And that has also happened in Mozambique. And I think such policies are those that will be able to promote industrialization. Basically, the fact that there was very expensive power before, which came down in terms of cost, could make many more industries break even because of this type of available fuels. But basically, the economics would be essential in analyzing what options to use going forward. Thank you.
Great. And obviously transparency quite important there as well to analyze those the economics of these transactions to make sure that they work. I wanted to make sure I have to leave the last word to our country representatives. Nadir, I saw you wanted to come in maybe on this point. So first to you, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, and I'll keep it super brief. And I think extremely valid comments, I think, from the floor. And I agree with all of them, really. And I would say, again, we need to look at this in terms of from paper into practice. Right, so absolutely, I completely agree with the element of any project going forward should not just look at one carbon price actually, but a range of carbon prices. In general, anyone who knows me knows that my pet peeve is scenarios. We need to be looking at this from a really integrated way and understanding the risks. And the best way to do that is looking at it from scenarios. And carbon pricing is just one element of risk that's there, right? So again, in terms of market access, the assumptions that we're holding for how this will actually be developed and sold is something else. I agree again with the point in terms of the relative pricing and the parity between renewable energies versus using gas is also something that we need to question. But in order to do so, we need to have the tools, the expertise to do the analysis. And I agree with the point, but in terms of we had a joint. I was at a panel with the AFDB last year. The reality is a lot of countries don't even have economic models to understand the economics and the benefit from one project, much less when we're talking about integrated energy systems and modeling at a country level. So this goes back again to the points that were raised by other panel members. We need to have the right capacities, the right expertise, the right tools to enable countries to do this effectively and make informed decisions. That's what we need, informed decision making. And how do we help do that? I think that I just wanted to chime in there.
Essential points, actually. Thank you for that. Let's conclude this way. We started saying that our concern is that the perspectives of certain developing countries that are new to this space and balancing between climate and development and energy needs, that those perspectives may not be heard, that they may be forgotten, that there's different starting points, there's different challenges, different types of support that are needed. And in defining what an equitable and just transition means for the world, but especially for these countries, hearing those perspectives is the most important. So with that in mind, if I could just leave the last words to Agnes and Fredonyai, one or two sentences. What is the message that you want the audience to hear with that objective in mind, defining what would be a just and equitable transition for you and your countries?
So thank you, Amir. So I would say, looking at Suriname specifically, we are a highly indebted country at the moment. On the other side, a high forest cover and low deforestation country. If we combine that together, I think looking to the international community for support and significant support, I would say, and a nuanced approach towards, chasing the rapid adaptation to net zero. I would say a nuanced approach where we get support on capacity building, economic modeling, planning, scenario building, and what have you, and most important, access to financing.
Thank you. As I said in the beginning, Uganda has potentials of energy resources, not necessarily the fossil energy. Those resources which I already mentioned. And therefore, it means we have enough opportunities of investing in other energy resources without any worry about the fossil oil and gas. But besides, also we are aware that also the country is also investing for revenue purpose, for economic development. And for that matter, then we have a multi-sectoral approach in handling issues. So policy integration is the way to go. And therefore, we need policy realignment to take care of the national revenue, the environmental sustainability, and the climate resilience. Meaning from policy to action. So once we have realigned our policies, then we know that we have got action areas. We've got the NDC that is tackling both adaptation and mitigation. That's gearing towards economic development, human livelihoods, and including the climate resilience, at the same time the issue to be the sustainability. And therefore, we need to do one thing. We need to realign ourselves and embrace transition. But one message to the world, that all should be done in fairness and equity. And we should take into account the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities in the context of national priorities and capacities. So our capabilities must be supported in terms of system support, investments, financing, and capacity building. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much to the panelists. I hope we've made a modest contribution to our objective of making sure certain perspectives are heard, and it's all thanks to you. Thank you, and thanks to the audience. Thanks very much.